Hello everyone, I'm Casey. Today I want to tell you about Harley Sims, a mother from Texas. She flew to LA hoping for a surprise visit, but what she found instead was a family falling apart and a betrayal so cruel it was unforgivable. Let us step into Harley's emotions at the very moment everything began to crumble. The Los Angeles sun is nothing like the honest warmth back home in Texas. Out here, it is a blinding, artificial glare that feels bone dry against my skin, offering light but no real comfort. I stepped out of the taxi, clutching a heavy bag filled with carefully chosen gifts for Emma and Jack. My heart was thumping with that nervous, fluttery excitement only a grandmother feels when she is about to surprise her family. I had dipped into my retirement savings to book this flight, savings that, in this era of runaway inflation, feel as precious and finite as lifeblood. I had spent 40 years as an engineer, calculating risks and measuring tolerances, but nothing could have prepared me for the sudden, sharp chill that raced down my spine as I stood before the familiar iron gate. It made no sense in the 85-degree California heat. Every instinct I possessed was screaming that the system was failing. The evidence of neglect was everywhere I looked. Matilda's rose garden, her absolute pride, the place where she would spend hours meticulously pruning and feeding, was now a graveyard of shriveled, blackened thorns. The mailbox was choking on a week's worth of junk mail, and, more disturbingly, several bright red envelopes clearly marked as overdue utility bills. My knees nearly buckled when I saw Jack's little blue bicycle lying sideways in the driveway, coated in a layer of dust so thick it looked like an ancient relic abandoned weeks ago. I fumbled with trembling fingers for the spare key, hidden under a dead potted plant. The moment I crossed the threshold, the silence hit me like a physical blow. It was a lethal, heavy silence. There was no scent of cinnamon or fresh laundry, no sounds of children playing in the next room. There was only the smell of stagnant air and a hollow emptiness that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. On the dining table, scattered among a pile of final warnings, was a medical report. I leaned in, my eyes catching the words, Stage 4 carcinoma, patient name, Matilda Sims. My hands shook so violently, the paper rattled like dry leaves in a storm. My daughter was dying, and her home was being left to crumble into ruin around her. I stumbled back toward the door, my chest tightening until I could not draw a full breath. The pain was physical, radiating from my ribs down to my fingertips. Where was Matilda? Why had Gary not said a word to me? And why was he still accepting my monthly checks for home renovations, while every living thing in this house was being left to turn to ash? I stumbled out of that hollowed-out house, the crumpled medical report clutched in my hand like a death warrant. Los Angeles no longer looked like the city of dreams I had seen in movies. It had transformed into a sprawling, jagged maze of traps, and my daughter had been swallowed whole by one of them. The taxi ride to the UCLA Medical Center passed in a suffocating, airless silence. I stared out the window at the endless rows of palm trees blurring past, but my mind was stuck decades in the past. I kept seeing Matilda as a little girl, the way she would press her feverish forehead against my neck, seeking the safety only a mother can provide. How could I, an engineer who prided herself on observing every structural flaw and calculating every risk, have allowed my own daughter to fight the Reaper alone, thousands of miles away? A wave of regret surged up, thick and bitter like gall in the back of my throat. The hospital corridors reeked of industrial disinfectant and the quiet, heavy weight of collective despair. When I finally pushed open the heavy door to the ICU, my world did not just crack, it disintegrated. Matilda lay there, a fragile, pale shadow of herself, nearly lost amidst a forest of plastic tubing and the rhythmic metallic clicking of a ventilator. She looked heartbreakingly small on that vast expanse of sterile white bedding. Dr. Rivera approached me, his eyes etched with the kind of deep weariness that only comes from delivering too much bad news. Yet he offered a flicker of genuine compassion. He spoke in low, measured tones, listing the cold, hard numbers that defined her reality. Stage 4 carcinoma, bone metastasis, a prognosis measured in weeks, not months. Then he said something that cut deeper than any medical term. She had been admitted entirely alone. He explained that Gary was a rare sight in these halls, and when he did show up, his questions were never about his wife's pain or her comfort. They were always about the insurance coverage and the mounting hospital bills. Matilda had begged them to keep the truth from me. She did not want to burden me with more grief so soon after we lost Martha. She was terrified of becoming a weight around my neck, a poisonous idea that her husband had clearly spent months dripping into her ear until she believed it was her own. My ears began to ring, and for a moment, time simply stalled. I looked at my daughter's skeletal hands, mapped with the purple bruises of failed IV lines, and the engineer in me took over. Every system failure has a root cause, and the tragedy before me was not just caused by rogue cells. It was a deliberate, calculated isolation. Gary had severed every one of Matilda's lifelines, convincing her that her existence was nothing more than a mounting financial debt. I sat down on the hard plastic chair by her bed and took her hand. It was as cold as a Texas north wind in January. I whispered that I was here now, though I knew the sedation held her too deep to hear me. In that dim ICU light, the fear that had been paralyzing me began to crystallize into a cold, sharp-edged determination. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had sent Gary for home renovations and dental work for the kids. Savings I had earned through decades of sweat. It had never been a gift. It was a systematic robbery. He had traded my daughter's last hope for his own luxury. Standing there in the shadows, I made a silent vow to Martha's memory. Gary McCoy was going to answer for every tear and every single bruise he left on my daughter's soul. That vow I made, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the ICU, wasn't just a moment of high emotion. It was a formal commitment. I had spent my entire career in Texas, recalibrating high-pressure systems and fixing what others said was broken. But I had never stood before a structure as fundamentally compromised as my own family. When the first pale rays of the Los Angeles sun finally cut through the frosted hospital glass the next morning, I was still curled up in a stiff, faux leather armchair. The joints of a woman approaching 70 do not forgive a night spent on hospital furniture, and my back was staging a full-scale protest. Yet that physical ache was nothing compared to the crushing silence of the room. Gary was still nowhere to be found. There was no call, no text, not even a basic inquiry to see if the mother of his children had survived the night. I quickly began to learn the grueling rhythm of hospital survival. My breakfast became a rotation of bitter, lukewarm coffees from the vending machine, and my life was measured in the beep of monitors. I kept a notebook, logging Matilda's vitals and pain medication schedules with the obsessive precision of a structural report. An engineer needs data to function, but the only consistent data point I had was Gary's total disappearance. Every time I tried his cell, it rang until it hit that same rehearsed, falsely professional voicemail. Then came the moment the floor dropped out from under me. I tried to pay a small deposit for some of Matilda's incidental care using the secondary credit card I had provided Gary for family emergencies. The clerk at the billing desk handed it back with a small, sympathetic wince. It had been declined. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. I had poured my retirement savings into that account to ensure my grandkids were safe, but it had been drained. While Emma and Jack were eating canned food at a neighbor's house because their father was supposedly on a business trip, their mother was fighting for her life with nothing but a machine to help her breathe. This wasn't just a lack of character. It was a systematic, cold-blooded betrayal. Later that afternoon, I drove to the neighbor's house to collect Emma and Jack. The second they saw me, they didn't just run. They collapsed into my arms, sobbing into my coat. Jack looked up at me with eyes that were far too red and far too old, asking why their mother's vacation was taking so long. The words died in my throat. How do you tell an innocent child that the person they trust most has abandoned them in their darkest hour? I held them as tight as my aching arms would allow, breathing in the scent of their hair, and in that moment, the exhaustion simply evaporated. I knew right then that I didn't have the luxury of breaking down. I had to be the pillar for them, the one who keeps this small, fragile flame from being snuffed out by the cruelty waiting outside those doors. I wasn't just going to get my money back. I was going to dismantle the man who thought he could throw my daughter away like a piece of scrap metal. Gary left when his family needed him most. Have you ever faced the heavy lift of caregiving alone? We invite you to share your story or leave a word of hope for Harley below. Your wisdom and encouragement means so much to us. After putting Emma and Jack to bed at our kind neighbor's house, I made my way back to Matilda's home to gather some of her clothes and a few personal items for the hospital. The house was swallowed in a heavy, oppressive darkness, save for the weak amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains and casting long, skeletal shadows of those withered rose bushes across the floor. I moved quietly through the rooms, the familiar cushioning of my Skechers feeling unusually heavy against the hardwood floors. I had just finished packing a small overnight bag when a pair of bright headlights swept across the living room walls, followed by the aggressive, low-frequency roar of that brand-new Mercedes-Benz Gary loved to brag about. My heart skipped a beat, not out of a sense of fear, but because I could feel the static charge in the air, the heavy, electric stillness that always comes right before a massive storm breaks over the Texas plains. The front door swung wide with a careless, violent force. Gary stepped inside, bringing with him a cloying cloud of expensive cologne, mixed with the sharp, acidic scent of red wine and the salty tang of the ocean air. He was dressed in a crisp, white linen shirt, looking more like a man returning from a seaside gala than a husband with a wife clinging to life in the ICU. He stopped short when he saw me standing in the kitchen, his initial jolt of surprise quickly curdling into a sharp, condescending smirk. He asked what I was doing there, suggesting in a mocking tone that I should be back in Texas baking or doing whatever it is retired people do in the country. His voice dripped with an arrogance that bypassed any form of greeting or concern for his wife's state. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen table, the very table Matilda had saved every penny to buy, and began raiding the refrigerator for a drink, treating me like an uninvited ghost in my own daughter's home. I looked him square in the eye, drawing on every ounce of my engineering discipline to keep my voice from shaking. I told him clearly that Matilda was in the hospital, fighting for her life, and that his children had been surviving on canned food for 2 days while he was gone. He just gave a thin, dismissive laugh that sent a genuine chill down my spine. He told me I was being dramatic again, claiming the doctors always exaggerated things just to pad the bill. As for the kids, he waved it off, saying they were modern American children who preferred pizza to my traditional cooking anyway. Then he looked at me with a cold, hard stare and told me they didn't need an uninvited babysitter. He said I should head back to Texas before things got awkward, a blatant attempt to make me feel like a trespasser in the family I had spent my life supporting. I stepped closer to the table, my fingers brushing against the bright red disconnection notice I'd found earlier. I asked him about the money, the monthly checks I'd sent faithfully for Matilda's treatments and home repairs. I asked why my card had been declined at the hospital while she lay there breathing through a tube. For a split second, I saw his eyes flicker with a shadow of panic before he exploded into a choreographed fit of rage. He slammed his hand onto the table, shouting at me not to use my dusty old engineering mindset to scrutinize his finances. He claimed business required investment and that everything he did was to secure the family's future. He had the nerve to ask if I thought sending a few dollars gave me the right to control their lives, calling my concern an absolute insult. It was a textbook display of gaslighting, trying to twist his betrayal into my failure. I took a deep breath, feeling a steady, quiet strength rising within me. I told him that I might be getting older, but I certainly wasn't blind. I told him I saw the dying garden, the fear etched into Emma's face, and the vast emptiness in the bank accounts he called investments. I asked if he really thought his polished words could cover the rot underneath. Back in Texas, I said, we have a very specific word for men like him: parasites. Gary's face turned a deep, mottled red, and he stepped toward me, using his height to try and loom over me in an attempt to intimidate. He warned me to watch my mouth and reminded me that this was his house, threatening to call the police for trespassing if I didn't leave immediately. I didn't give an inch. I stood my ground and looked directly at this man who was visibly shaking now that someone had finally called his bluff. I told him to go ahead and call them. I told him to let the police see why a husband would leave his wife to die in a hospital while he was out partying. I told him they could look at the medical files and the stack of unpaid bills right here on the table. I made it clear I wasn't going anywhere until Matilda was safe and my grandchildren were properly cared for. I told him he might have been able to fool my daughter with his sweet talk, but to me, he was just a broken machine that needed to be taken apart. He stood there stunned, the confidence of a con artist finally cracking under the weight of a mother's resolve. He eventually stomped off toward the back of the house, slamming the door so hard the frames rattled, leaving me alone in the cold kitchen. The anxiety that had gripped me when I first arrived was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged confidence. I wasn't just a grandmother from the country anymore. I was Harley Sims, and I had found a new mission: to protect my blood from the hands of a man who didn't know the meaning of the word family. Gary's front door slamming shut behind me still echoes in my mind like a dry crack of thunder in a cloudless Los Angeles sky. I left that house, leaving behind a man trembling beneath his arrogant veneer, and returned to the place that truly needed me, room 402. As I stepped into the hospital corridor at 2 a.m, the silence here was fundamentally different from the silence in that house. It did not carry the stale stench of resentment. Instead, it smelled of clinical oxygen, sharp antiseptic, and the shallow, rhythmic breaths of people fighting to stay tethered to this world. I took my familiar seat beside Matilda, feeling the biting chill of the air conditioning against my aged, wrinkled skin. It was just me, my daughter, and the steady mechanical clicking of the machines doing the heavy lifting that her tired heart no longer could. I watched Matilda's parched, cracked lips and used a small, damp swab to gently moisten them. In the dim, artificial glow of the monitors, she looked like a wax figure beginning to melt away. Back home in Texas, we always say that family is the harbor where you anchor your soul. But looking at Matilda now, I saw a shipwreck lost in a vast, silent ocean of loneliness. Gary had turned his marriage into a transaction, treating care like a commodity with a shelf life. Once he decided she no longer had any utility, he simply discarded her. This kind of loneliness isn't just about being physically alone. It is the crushing realization that you have been forgotten while you are still drawing breath. I stroked her thin, fragile hair, my heart tightening as I recalled our recent brief phone calls. She would always say she was fine and that Gary was taking such good care of her. I see now that those words were never the truth. They were the final wall she built to protect me from her pain. The emotional abuse Gary inflicted was more predatory than any cancer cell. He had successfully convinced her that her suffering was a sin, and her very existence was an unbearable burden to those she loved. As the night deepened, I felt smaller and smaller in that sterile room. I found myself reaching out for Martha, remembering how he would squeeze my hand whenever a tractor broke down in the field or when the bills piled up too high. If he were here, he would tell me that I am an engineer and I need to find the point of failure and weld it back together. But how do you repair a soul that has been eroded by years of cold indifference? I lowered my head beside Matilda's hand, letting rare tears soak into the stark white sheets. I wasn't just grieving her illness. I was grieving the years she spent living in Gary's shadow. This silence is a trial, but it is also a declaration. Gary might have the money, the cars, and the sharp tongue, but he does not have this presence. I will be here, even if the rest of the world turns its back, because the love of a mother from Texas does not know how to spell the word quit. The silence in Matilda's hospital room no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had shifted, ripening into that heavy, oppressive stillness that settles over the Texas Gulf Coast just before a hurricane tears the sky open. I sat there in the dim light, the only sound the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of the ventilator, and looked down at my old iPhone. My fingers were trembling, not with age, but with the cold, hard electricity of a woman who had spent 40 years looking for stress fractures in high-pressure systems. After the way Gary had sneered at me in that kitchen, my engineering instincts were screaming at me. Something was leaking. Something was being drained. I took a slow, deep breath, the sharp scent of clinical antiseptic stinging my nostrils like a warning. It was time for a full-scale audit, the kind Gary McCoy never saw coming. The blue light of the screen washed over my face, highlighting every wrinkle, every line of a life spent working for every cent I owned. I logged into the joint savings account, the one I had foolishly authorized Gary to access so he could handle the home renovations and the grandkids' college funds while I was away in Texas. I expected to see the slow, steady drain of medical bills, but what I found were open wounds on a balance sheet. My eyes scanned the line items, and the blood in my veins began to boil. $1,200 at a high-end steakhouse in Beverly Hills. $3,500 at a luxury watch boutique. My vision blurred for a second as the numbers swam before me. Then, the killing blow appeared on the screen. $15,000 transferred in a single lump sum to a yacht charter company in Marina del Rey. $15,000. That was money I had earned by sweating through double shifts under a relentless Texas sun. That was money meant for Matilda's chemotherapy, for Emma's braces, for Jack's future. He hadn't just spent it. He had siphoned the very lifeblood out of this family to feed a cheap plastic vanity. I felt a sharp stabbing pain in my chest, a pressure so intense it felt like someone was squeezing my heart in a vice. But my mind, the mind of an engineer, refused to shut down. It began to race with a terrifying, cold efficiency. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was a deliberate act of sabotage. I wasn't finished. I opened Facebook, an app I rarely touched, but I knew Gary couldn't breathe without an audience. There it was, right at the top of the feed, posted barely an hour ago. Gary was standing on the prow of a sleek white yacht, a glass of expensive vintage wine in his hand, flanked by a group of people he probably called his elite circle. The caption read, "Living my best life, savoring every luxury." I looked at that image. Then I looked back at my daughter, lying there pale and skeletal, tangled in a web of plastic tubes. The contrast was nauseating. He was literally celebrating his luxury on the back of his wife's suffering. He wasn't just a con artist. He was a moral void, a man who found joy in the wreckage of his own family. A wave of pure, unadulterated disgust rose in my throat. I remembered something my late husband Martha used to say back on the farm. "Harley, if a part is so rusted it's going to break the whole machine, you don't oil it. You cut it out." I stood up, my movements sharp and purposeful. I couldn't do this in front of Matilda. She didn't need this poison in her room. I walked out into the long, empty hospital corridor and stood by a window overlooking the rushing lights of the Los Angeles freeway. I wasn't crying anymore. Tears are for the broken, and I was busy getting organized. I pulled up the contact for my bank back in Texas. I didn't care that it was late. I knew the manager, and I knew exactly what I had to do. When the woman on the other end picked up, I didn't hesitate. I told her exactly who I was and that I needed to report a massive string of fraudulent transactions. I requested an immediate freeze on every single account and credit card linked to the name Gary McCoy. My voice was as calm and steady as the day I gave my final project report before retirement. The kind of voice that doesn't ask for permission, but issues a command. The clerk sounded surprised, but as I recited the account numbers and reaffirmed my sole ownership of the primary funds, she went to work. I could hear the rapid, rhythmic clicking of her keyboard through the line. It sounded like a victory march. She confirmed it was done. Every card was voided. Gary's online access was severed. The tap was officially dry. I hung up the phone and felt a surge of raw, primal energy coursing through me. But I wasn't quite done. I knew where Gary was, and I knew he was likely about to run up an even bigger bill for his fancy guests. I pulled up our message thread and typed out a short clinical note. "I hope you are enjoying the party, Gary, but remember, that yacht was rented with my money, and I just cut the power. Good luck with the bill." Barely 5 minutes passed before my phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. It was Gary. I didn't answer. He called again, then a third time, the screen flashing his name like a trapped animal scratching at a cage. Then the text started pouring in. He was frantic. He was demanding to know what I had done. He claimed his cards had been declined right in front of his friends. He accused me of trying to humiliate him and ordered me to unlock the accounts immediately. I sat down in the hard plastic chair in the hallway and watched the screen blink, a cold, thin smile crossing my face. His humiliation was a grain of sand compared to the mountain of pain Matilda was climbing every single day. He had chosen vanity over her life, and now he was going to have to look at the reality he had tried so hard to ignore. I eventually walked back into the room and took Matilda's frail, cool hand in mine. I leaned down and whispered into her ear, telling her not to be afraid. I told her that I had taken care of the system error. I promised her that from this moment on, no one was going to take another thing from her or her children. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there watching every rise and fall of her chest, feeling like I had just performed the most critical surgery of my life. I knew that tomorrow would bring legal battles, more threats from Gary, and moments where my old bones would feel the weight of this fight. But standing there between life and death, I realized that the true strength of a woman isn't measured in muscle. It's measured in the absolute, unyielding will to protect her blood at any cost. I am Harley Sims, and I am going to pull my family out of this wreckage, starting by sweeping that parasite right out of our lives for good. After I put the phone down and let Gary's frantic, venomous messages go unanswered, a wave of pure exhaustion finally pulled me under. That sharp electric high I had felt when I froze the accounts didn't last long. It was quickly replaced by a bone-deep weariness that seemed to settle right into my marrow. I walked back into Matilda's room and sat down in the familiar heavy shadows, with only the soft blue light from the monitors blinking like distant stars in a dark sky. Sometimes, being the strong one is a very lonely business. Back in Texas, I could spend all day fixing a broken tractor by myself. But repairing a family that has been systematically dismantled takes more than just steel tools and grit. For a fleeting second, I wondered if I was being too ruthless, if my engineer's heart had turned to stone. But then I looked at my daughter's hollowed-out face, and every doubt I had vanished into the cold hospital air. The door creaked open just a fraction, and Dr. Rivera stepped in, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He didn't head straight for the charts like he usually did. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat directly across from me, his movements slow and deliberate. He told me I needed to close my eyes, even for just a moment, noting that I had been at that bedside for nearly 48 hours straight. I took the cup he offered, feeling the warmth of the paper sleeve seep into my chilled palms. I told him I couldn't sleep because there was simply too much that was broken outside of this room. Dr. Rivera looked at Matilda and then back at me, his gaze turning serious but remaining deeply human. He said he had worked in this ICU for a decade and had seen every kind of family dynamic imaginable. But he told me that my resilience was something special. He pointed out that while Gary was the emergency contact on paper, I was the one actually keeping Matilda's soul tethered to this world. His words felt like a gentle touch on an open wound, making me realize I wasn't just some meddling old woman making a scene. I was a protector, finally standing my ground. I hesitated for a moment before asking him about the things Gary had said, about Matilda just being tired and the hospital exaggerating her condition for profit. Dr. Rivera let out a long, heavy sigh and set his coffee down. He told me clearly that what Gary was doing was a form of psychological abuse. He explained that by denying the severity of her illness, Gary was making Matilda feel guilty for even being in pain. He told me that Matilda hadn't just been admitted because of the cancer. She was in a state of total collapse because of a lack of basic care and an unbearable amount of mental pressure. He looked me in the eye and said that what I was doing, cutting off Gary's resources to focus solely on Matilda and the children, wasn't just financially responsible. It was a psychological lifeline for them. Hearing those words from a professional felt like a 1,000-pound weight being lifted off my shoulders. An engineer always needs an independent audit to make sure the path they are taking is sound, and Dr. Rivera had just given me exactly that. He promised to provide me with full medical records and detailed notes on Gary's documented neglect to support me in the legal battles he knew were coming. For the first time since I stepped off that plane from Texas, I felt like I had a solid foundation beneath my feet. Dr. Rivera stood up and gave my shoulder a gentle pat before he left, telling me to finish my coffee and to believe him when he said Matilda had been responding better since I arrived. He said she could sense the safety I brought into the room. I watched him disappear behind the heavy door and turned back to my daughter. A thin, pale sliver of dawn was beginning to find its way through the gap in the heavy curtains. I realized then that no matter how much Gary tried to manipulate or threaten me, he couldn't win against the truth and a mother's love. I took a small notepad from my bag and started a list of what came next. Finding a family lawyer in LA and making the arrangements to get Emma and Jack back to the safety of Texas. The road ahead was still long and full of jagged edges, but the fear was gone. I am Harley Sims, and I have finally found the allies I need to win back the peace for the people I love. Has a stranger's kindness ever lit your way during a dark time? Dr. Rivera's support for Harley proves that help arrives exactly when needed. Do you believe truth and love will eventually triumph over Gary's selfishness? Please share your wisdom or stories below. I'd love to hear from you. The dawn in Los Angeles began to crawl over the windowsill of the hospital room, looking pale and weak, much like the life flickering inside. I sat there, my fingers still tightly entwined with Matilda's thin, frail hand, as the mechanical sigh of the ventilator provided in soulless, rhythmic confirmation that my daughter was still here with me. I found myself tracing the band of my wedding ring, the gold worn thin and smooth by decades of labor, yet it felt strangely warm against my skin. In that fragile space between exhaustion and cold, piercing clarity, my mind drifted away from this sterile room and back to the wide, open plains of Texas. I could almost smell the sharp scent of diesel fuel and the sweet, heavy aroma of ripening wheat under a summer sun. Most of all, I remembered the absolute, unshakable peace that Martha had brought into my life for 40 years. A sense of security that was as solid as the limestone beneath our feet. Martha was never a degreed engineer like I was. He was a farmer with hands as rough as sandpaper and a heart that was as expansive as a West Texas horizon. Yet, he understood the structural integrity of a family better than any architect ever could. I spent countless afternoons watching him on the porch, hunched over his ancient John Deere tractor, his brow furrowed in concentration. He used to tell me that a machine was only as good as the trust between its parts. He warned me that if a single bolt became rusted and started to compromise the metal around it, you couldn't afford to be sentimental. You had to replace it immediately to save the entire system. Back then, I just laughed and thought he was being overly practical. But as I look at the wreckage Gary McCoy has made of our lives, I finally understand the lesson in Martha's decisiveness. Martha spent his whole life being the strongest, most reliable bolt in our machine, ensuring that Matilda and I were always safe from the friction of the world. My thoughts turned back to the summer of 1998, when a massive supercell storm tore through Lubbock. The windows in our farmhouse were shattering from the pressure, the power was cut, and muddy water began seeping under the front door. Matilda was only 10 years old then, a trembling little girl hiding under the heavy oak dining table. Martha didn't yell at her for being afraid, and he didn't tell her to just get over it. Instead, he wrapped her in his thickest canvas coat, sat right there on the floor with her, and told her stories about the stars that were still shining behind those black clouds. He used his own broad body to shield her from the wind howling through the broken glass. That was the image of a real man, someone who used their strength to protect, never to exploit. The contrast with Gary was so bitter it made me want to scream into the silence of the ICU. Gary had abandoned his wife in the middle of a cancer storm just to chase a fake, shallow sun on a rented yacht. He wasn't a man. He was just a greedy, hollow ghost hiding behind the facade of a successful businessman. Martha and I had worked ourselves to the bone for every single dollar in that savings account. I remembered the dry winters when we had to tighten our belts so much it hurt. Martha once gave up on buying a much-needed set of tires for his old Ford truck, just so Matilda could afford to go to a summer design camp she had been dreaming about. He told me that money was nothing more than a tool, Harley, and it only had value when it could be transformed into a smile on our daughter's face. The $15,000 that Gary threw away on a single weekend of vanity wasn't just a number on a ledger. It represented Martha's sweat under a 100-degree sun and the nights I spent hunched over engineering blueprints until my eyes blurred. By stealing that money, Gary hadn't just committed a crime. He had trampled over the sacrifices of a father who was no longer here to defend them. A cold, quiet fury rose within me. But it wasn't the blind rage of a victim. It was the conviction of a judge. I was going to reclaim every cent, not because I craved the money, but because I refused to let that man humiliate Martha's memory any longer. I stared at the clear tubes feeding medication into Matilda's veins, and the engineer in me began to analyze the flow. Gary was a blockage in my daughter's life. He had manipulated her until a brilliant, confident designer believed she was nothing more than a frightened burden. Martha would never have allowed that to happen. He always made sure Matilda knew she was a treasure. He used to tell her that she didn't owe anyone anything except the responsibility to be happy. Gary had inverted every one of those values, turning love into a debt and illness into a form of financial blackmail. I closed my eyes and took a long, steady breath. And for a moment, I could almost feel Martha standing right there behind me. I could feel his large, calloused hand resting on my shoulder, sending a wave of warmth through my aching, exhausted body. I could almost hear his voice echoing in the quiet of the room, telling me that I already knew what needed to be done. He was right. An engineer never allows a system error to persist once it has been identified. I opened my eyes and saw Matilda stir ever so slightly. Her eyes flickered open for a brief second, looking hazy and tired. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, whispering that I was here and that her father was here too. I promised her right then that we were going to bring her home. Home wasn't this LA apartment filled with unpaid bills and red disconnection notices. Home was Texas, a place that understood the weight of the truth and the power of unconditional love. The loneliness that had tried to swallow me at midnight was gone, replaced by a resolve as hard as iron. I didn't feel like a lonely old woman anymore. I was the keeper of the Sims family fire, and that fire was going to burn through every lie Gary McCoy ever told. This morning, I wasn't just going to be the mother sitting by a hospital bed. I was going to be the executor of Martha's justice. I pulled out my notebook and began writing down every memory of how Martha treated this family, using it as my blueprint for the confrontation ahead. I was going to show Gary the difference between a man who has money and a family that has values. Gary thought he could use my own savings to buy my silence and his loyalty. But he had made a fatal calculation error. He forgot that I come from a land of storms and from a people who never learned how to kneel. This legal battle wasn't going to be just about the dollars. It was about restoring Matilda's dignity and securing a future for Emma and Jack. I am ready, Martha. Watch me take this man apart, piece by piece. The strength I drew from the memories of Martha felt like a quiet miracle manifesting in the cramped, sterile space of the ICU. As the golden California sun began its morning dance across the starch-white bedsheets, I noticed the slightest tremor in Matilda's eyelashes. I held my breath, my heart thumping against my ribs with the anxious rhythm of a girl on her first date. I leaned in, whispering her name, Tilly, over and over as I gripped her thin, cool hand. This time, there was no vacant blinking or distant stare. Her eyes, those deep, honest brown eyes so much like her father's, opened fully and found mine. A single crystal-clear tear tracked slowly down her pale cheek, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the machine-led silence was broken by something human and real. Her first words, whispered in a voice made raspy and hollow by the breathing tube that had only been removed hours before, weren't about her pain or her thirst. She looked at me and whispered that she was sorry. My heart constricted so tightly it physically hurt. This was the true poison Gary had spent months injecting into her spirit. The idea that her illness was a moral failure on her part. In shallow, labored breaths, she confessed that Gary had told her every single medical bill was a hammer blow to their children's future. He had told her that if I ever found out how sick she was, the grief would break me, just like it had supposedly broken her father. He had taken her love for me and turned it into a weapon, using it to build a cage of absolute, crushing isolation around her. I pulled my chair even closer, cupping her small, fragile face in my own rough, calloused hands. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her that she was never, ever a burden. I told her she was a treasure, a precious gift that Martha and I had cherished from the moment she was born. I told her that every word Gary had said was a lie, a cruel attempt to keep her quiet and small. I explained that the money was taken care of, that I had frozen the accounts, and that Emma and Jack were safe and loved. I saw her shoulders finally drop, a physical release of a 1,000-pound weight she had been carrying all alone. She began to cry then, but it wasn't the sound of despair. It was the sound of a woman finally breathing again. This reconciliation didn't need grand speeches or dramatic vows. It just needed the truth to be laid bare under the light of unconditional love. We sat there for a long time, hand in hand, letting the hours slip away without any concern for the world outside. I spoke to her about Texas, about the way the wildflowers were just beginning to prepare for their season back home on our land. I saw a small, fragile smile touch her lips, the first spark of real hope I had seen in years. I told her firmly that I wasn't going anywhere. I promised to be her legs when she was weak and her voice when she was tired. We were going to take back everything Gary had tried to steal, starting with her sense of self and her dignity. In that quiet room, I knew the repair work on our family had truly begun from the inside out. The most critical failure, the break in trust, had been sealed with the simple, unyielding honesty of a mother who refused to give up. After that tearful but liberating conversation with Matilda, I realized I could no longer afford to just sit there and hope things would improve on their own. A real engineer never waits for a broken machine to fix itself. They have to step in and redesign the entire process from the ground up. Los Angeles continued its chaotic roar outside the hospital windows. But inside the four walls of room 402, I began establishing an absolute safety zone. I pulled out my notebook and drew straight, methodical lines on a fresh page. Step 1. remove the obstructions. Step 2. Reinforce the resources. Step 3. Protect the vulnerable. A strange, cooling calm washed over me, the kind of stillness a mother from Texas feels when she knows she is standing on the side of the absolute truth. I started by contacting one of the most reputable home nursing agencies in the city. I refused to let Matilda feel like a burden for even one more second. I hired a woman named Sarah, a nurse with kind eyes and hands that moved with a quiet, practiced professionalism. Together, we built a detailed care plan that looked more like a blueprint for recovery than a medical chart. We included everything from a personalized, high-protein nutrition plan to gentle physical therapy and the lavender essential oils Matilda had always loved back home. I watched as Sarah helped Matilda change her dressings with such tenderness, chatting easily about favorite television shows as if they were just two friends spending an afternoon together. That was what real care looked like. It was not a financial transaction or a nuisance, as Gary had always implied. It was a profound respect for the dignity of a human being fighting for her life. I paid for every cent of it, using my own private accounts, the funds I had finally wrestled back from Gary's greedy grip. Being able to use the money I had earned with my own hands to buy my daughter some peace was the most valuable investment I had ever made. By late afternoon, my phone began to vibrate again. This time, I decided to answer. Gary's voice came through the line, but the old arrogance was gone. In its place was a jagged, desperate anger that shook with every word. He screamed about his Mercedes being repossessed by the leasing company because of the overdue payments I had cut off. He raged about his yacht club membership being frozen and how his so-called elite friends were now laughing behind his back. He told me I had no right to control his life, and then he reached for the only weapon a coward has left. He threatened to take me to court and sue for full custody of Emma and Jack, promising that I would never see my grandchildren again. He was trying to use those innocent children as a form of emotional blackmail. I could hear him panting into the receiver, the sound of a man who had just realized his hollow world was collapsing. Back in Texas, we know that when a stray dog is backed into a corner, it barks the loudest. Gary McCoy was barking as loud as he could. I let him finish his tirade, and then I answered him with a voice that was as cold and steady as a steel beam. I told him he could sue whenever he liked, but I also reminded him that I held every bank statement showing he used his wife's medical fund for parties. I told him I had Dr. Rivera's detailed medical notes documenting the neglect that had nearly cost Matilda her life. And most importantly, I told him I had the truth. I paused for a moment to let the weight of it sink in. I asked him if he really wanted to talk about custody when he didn't even know what Jack liked for breakfast or what grade Emma was in. I pointed out that he had abandoned them with a neighbor just to go play on a boat. I told him a Los Angeles judge would find those facts very interesting. I warned him never to threaten a mother who has already seen the worst and has nothing left to lose. I hung up before he could muster a response. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt a deep, quiet contempt for the man who had once been my son-in-law. I walked back to Matilda's bedside and found she had heard parts of the call. She asked me with a trembling voice if he could really take the children away. I took her hand and looked her straight in the eye, promising her that no one was going to take anyone from us ever again. I told her I had already prepared the ground. My lawyer would be arriving in the morning, and we were going to do everything by the book, transparent, legal, and unshakable. I started making calls to Martha's old friends back home, men and women in the legal profession, and neighbors in Texas who were ready to testify to the character of our family. My defense system wasn't just built on cash. It was built on the truth and a solid network of people who actually cared. That night, for the first time in weeks, I saw Matilda fall into a deep, restful sleep. I knew the storm wasn't entirely over, but we finally had a house made of stone to shelter in. Using children as a threat is a line that should never be crossed. Have you ever had to stand tall to protect your family from harm? Does the grandmother's resilience move you? Please share your thoughts below or leave a like to show your support for Harley and Matilda. As an engineer, one of the most sobering lessons you learn is that no system is ever truly permanent or perfect. Even after you have welded the deepest cracks and reinforced the primary structures, the smallest internal vibrations can still bring the whole thing down if you let your guard down for even a second. After those few brief golden days where Matilda seemed to be gaining ground, I allowed myself to believe that I had finally stabilized the situation. But nature and illness do not care about your plans. At exactly 3:15 on Tuesday morning, that hollow hour when the darkness over the streets of Los Angeles feels the most suffocating, the monitors began to wail. It was a sharp, jagged sound that tore through the artificial peace of room 402 like a serrated blade. I bolted upright in my chair, a numbing cold racing down my spine. A new system failure had emerged, and this time, the rot was moving through my daughter's very lifeblood. Matilda began to shake with violent, rhythmic tremors that made the IV lines rattle against the metal poles. Her skin was radiating a dry, furnace-like heat, yet her lips were turning a terrifying shade of bruised purple. Sarah, the nurse I had hired to be our extra set of eyes, moved before I could even process the noise. She was calling for Dr. Rivera before she even reached the bedside, her voice professional, but tight with a localized urgency that made my lungs feel small. She looked at me quickly and said the words that no mother ever wants to hear: septic shock. I forced myself to back away and stand against the far wall, pressing my palms flat against the cold plaster to keep my hands from shaking. An engineer is trained not to panic when the pressure gauges hit the red zone. You are trained to observe the flow. I watched as the medical team flooded into the room, a blur of blue scrubs and focused intensity. They were pushing high-dose antibiotics, adjusting the oxygen flow on the ventilator, and calling out blood pressure numbers that were falling away like a stone in a well. It was a brutal confrontation between modern science and the sheer destructive power of rogue cells. Matilda looked heartbreakingly small amidst the chaos, almost as if she were dissolving into the stark white linens. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, whispering to Martha, to the universe, to anyone listening, that I had already made the arrangements to bring her home to Texas, and she was not allowed to let go now. Right in the middle of this life-and-death struggle, a different kind of chaos erupted just outside the heavy double doors of the ICU. Gary had arrived. He wasn't alone. He had brought along a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, whom he kept loudly referring to as his legal counsel. Gary looked like a man who had been unraveling for days. His clothes were wrinkled, his jaw was covered in thick, uneven stubble, and his eyes had the frantic, predatory look of a gambler who had just lost his last cent and was looking for someone to blame. He was shouting about his rights, demanding to be led into the room, and accusing me of neglecting his wife with experimental treatments. He was trying to use this medical crisis as a piece of evidence to prove I was unfit to make decisions. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it made my blood turn to ice. He was actually standing there, hoping his wife would weaken, just so he could regain his grip on the family's finances. I felt a surge of pure, focused outrage. But I didn't rush out to scream back at him. A good engineer knows how to use the safety barriers they have already installed. I stepped out into the hallway and stood directly in his path, blocking the doorway with my own body. I told him as calmly as I could that he was currently in violation of the temporary restraining order my lawyer had filed the previous afternoon. Before he could even finish his next insult, the 2 hospital security guards I had briefed earlier moved in. I had already provided them with his photograph and a copy of the court's initial ruling regarding his access to the floor. Gary tried to shove past them, his voice rising into a shrill, hysterical pitch, calling me a crazy old woman and accusing me of killing his wife. But the system I had built held firm. Sarah stepped out of the room just long enough to tell the guards that the patient was in critical condition and that Gary's presence was a direct threat to her survival. Watching him being marched down the hall in total humiliation, his lawyer scurrying away like a rat in the shadows, brought me no joy, only a profound sense of relief. He was a component that had been rusted beyond repair, and the only thing left to do was to discard him entirely. When the hallway was finally quiet again, I walked back into the room to find Dr. Rivera wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at me and gave a small, weary nod, telling me that they had finally managed to break the fever. Her blood pressure was beginning to climb back into a safe range. He called her a fighter, and for the first time in hours, I felt the tension in my chest loosen. I sank into the chair by her bed, and that was when my legs finally began to shake, a delayed reaction to the sheer weight of the last hour. My care system had passed its most brutal stress test. The professionalism of the staff, the legal walls I had built, and the security protocols had all functioned together to form a steel cage of protection around my daughter. Matilda flickered her eyes open for a fleeting second and looked at me. I leaned down and told her that everything was okay now, that the intruder had been sent away, and that no one was going to disturb her rest again. We had won another difficult round, but I knew the final journey of bringing her back to the peace of Texas still had one more challenging chapter ahead of us. The morning light in room 402 was brighter than it had been on any day since I arrived. Perhaps it was because I had finally asked Sarah to pull the heavy hospital curtains all the way back, allowing the honest, golden sun to reach into the darkest corners of the room. Matilda had finally climbed out of the valley of the shadow. She was sitting up against her pillows, and though her face was still pale and drawn from the biological storm she had just weathered, there was a spark of life in her eyes that I had feared was gone forever. On the small bedside table, where a chaotic mess of medical trays and plastic cups usually sat, there was now a single, thick legal folder with the bold red seal of the court sitting on top, like a silent guardian. I smoothed out the front of my shirt, feeling the crisp starchiness of the fabric against my skin, like a layer of freshly forged armor. An engineer knows that before you can officially sign off on a massive structural project, there must be one final, brutal inspection to ensure every single defect has been identified and eradicated at the root. Today, that inspection had a name: the truth. Standing beside me was Mr. Miller, a seasoned family lawyer I had flown in from Texas on the red-eye. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was one of Martha's oldest friends, a man who understood that honor was something you lived by, not just something you talked about over dinner. We had spent the entire night systematizing every piece of evidence I had painstakingly gathered. We had the bank statements, clearly showing exactly where my hard-earned retirement savings had gone. Every cent of that $15,000 that Gary had thrown away on luxury yacht rentals, while Matilda's medical bills sat collecting dust and overdue notices. We had Dr. Rivera's detailed logs about the neglect Matilda suffered and the toxic, abusive messages Gary had sent me when he thought I wasn't looking. Gary thought he could win this with noise, intimidation, and the same old lies. But he forgot that in a structural blueprint, it is the quiet precision of the lines that determines the strength of the building, not the volume of the construction machinery. The heavy door to the room creaked open, and Gary walked in. He wasn't accompanied by the cheap, fast-talking attorney he had brought before. He looked like a man who was already losing a war he didn't realize he had started. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled and stained. His eyes were sunken with dark circles, and that practiced, smug arrogance had been replaced by a jagged, desperate kind of aggression. He tried to move toward Matilda's bed, likely preparing to launch into another round of his practice gaslighting, but Mr. Miller stepped directly into his path with an authority that stopped him dead in his tracks. Miller advised him to sit down in the far chair, informing him in a low, dangerous voice, but we had several agreements to finalize before the Los Angeles police were invited to take a formal look into his systematic financial fraud and the criminal neglect of a dependent. The mere mention of the police hit Gary right in his primary vulnerability, his desperate fear of losing his social standing and being seen for exactly what he was. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, asking if I was really going to be the one to destroy this family. I looked back at him without a single tremor in my voice and told him I wasn't destroying anything. I was simply cleaning up the wreckage he had already made. Mr. Miller began to lay out the bank statements on the table one by one, the sharp rustling of the paper sounding like a gavel striking a bench in the quiet room. He walked through the numbers with a cold, clinical efficiency that left no room for Gary to hide. $15,000 for the Sea Spirit yacht, while the hospital was sending final disconnection notices for his wife's care. $5,000 for a new watch, while Emma was told there was no money for her new school books. He laid out the blatant breach of fiduciary duty and the way Gary had manipulated the power of attorney documents. Gary tried to argue, his voice cracking and rising as he talked about the necessity of maintaining an image for his business and making investments for their future. But I cut him off. I asked him what he planned to pay me back with, whether he thought my daughter's life or the stolen future of my grandchildren was a fair trade for his vanity. I told him he had nothing left to invest because his only source of power, which was my trust and my money, had been permanently and legally severed. Then came the final document in the folder, an uncontested, unilateral divorce settlement. The terms we had drafted were absolute and non-negotiable. Gary would walk away with nothing but the clothes on his back. He would surrender every right to Matilda's assets, except her sole and total custody of Emma and Jack, with my supportive legal guardianship, and sign a binding 5-year no-contact order. Miller made the choice very clear to him. If Gary signed the papers right now, I would decline to file the formal criminal charges for fraud and neglect. He would be allowed to keep just enough of his shredded reputation to go start his parasitic life somewhere else where people didn't know his name. If he refused, the photos I had of him partying on that yacht while his wife lay dying in the ICU would be on the front page of every local paper and in every police report by the end of the business day. Gary looked at Matilda, perhaps hoping for one last moment of weakness or a lingering shred of love he could exploit. But my daughter looked right back at him with a strength I hadn't seen in years. She told him to sign the papers. She told him she was no longer his burden to carry, and more importantly, he was no longer a burden on her life or the lives of her children. Gary's hand was shaking visibly as he gripped the pen. He looked at that legal folder like it was his own death warrant. With a bitter, humiliated sigh that filled the room with the smell of defeat, he scrawled his name across the bottom of the pages. Each signature felt like a final weld, a clean, permanent break that separated the rot from the healthy metal of my family. When he finally threw the pen down on the table and walked out of that room without looking back, I felt a rush of clean, cool air finally fill my lungs for the first time since I stepped off that plane. The system was finally clean. I moved to the bed and held Matilda close, and we both cried. But these weren't tears of grief or fear. They were tears of pure, unadulterated liberation. Mr. Miller gave me a small, knowing smile as he packed away the finalized files, congratulating me on successfully reclaiming the original blueprint of my family. I looked out the window at the skyline of Los Angeles and told Matilda that it was over. I told her we were going home. We were going back to Texas. That night, I sat alone in the quiet of the hospital room, but for the first time, I wasn't sitting there to watch for betrayal or to guard against a predator. I was sitting there to savor the peace. I called Emma and Jack at the neighbor's house and told them that their grandmother and their mother would be coming for them very soon for a long journey back to the ranch. I had used an engineer's cold, logical mind to dismantle a villain, but it was a mother's fierce, unconditional love that allowed me to reassemble hope from the broken pieces. Tomorrow, we would be on a plane, leaving the city of hollow promises behind. Gary McCoy could keep his memories of fake luxury and rented yachts. We were keeping each other. That was the only asset that truly mattered in this life, the kind of wealth that no amount of stolen money could ever buy. I closed my eyes and felt Matilda's hand squeeze mine in the dark. A long, painful chapter of our lives had closed with absolute justice. We had won, not through hatred or revenge, but through the unyielding, iron-willed resolve of the women of the Sims family. A year has passed as quickly as a blink when you are busy being happy. I am standing on my porch in Texas now, where the wind from the fields carries the scent of dry hay and absolute freedom. Those suffocating nights in the Los Angeles ICU have faded into a distant memory, like an old discarded blueprint that has been replaced by something much stronger. I look down at my hands. They are still rough and worn, but they no longer shake with the cold tremors of outrage. Our family system is running again, and this time, it is built to last a lifetime. Under the shade of the old oak tree, Matilda is sitting with her sketchbook. Her face has found its healthy color again, and her hair is growing back thick and dark. The periodic treatments at our local clinic are going well, but I know the real medicine has been the sense of safety we have built here. Emma and Jack are chasing a puppy through the tall grass, their laughter ringing out across the land. There is no more fear in their eyes, no more flinching at the sound of a raised voice. We just finished baking a batch of cookies using Martha's original recipe. The scent of warm butter and sugar fills the air, patching up every hollow space Gary ever left behind. He is nothing more than a name on a dusty divorce decree now. He chose the luxury of a yacht, but we chose each other. In this part of Texas, we have always known which one is worth more. That brings us to the end of Harley Sims' story. When I look back at this journey, I do not just see a financial recovery or a legal victory. I see the incredible, quiet power of a mother. Harley used her engineer's mind not for the sake of revenge, but to dismantle a toxic cycle and rebuild the foundation of hope for her daughter. The biggest lesson I have taken away from this is simple. Never let anyone, no matter how close they are, convince you that your illness or your moments of weakness make you a burden. The person trying to plant that thought in your head is the one who is truly toxic to your family values. A real family is the one place where you should be allowed to be at your weakest and still feel like you are at your safest. What did you think of Harley's journey? Which lesson or message touched your heart the most throughout this series? Sometimes, a decisive act of strength is the only way to protect the people we love. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, as I truly value hearing your perspectives. I'm Casey, and I look forward to bringing you more stories of resilience and truth very soon.